3 days. That's all it took. 3 days of backchannel phone calls, emergency cipher messages, and closed-door meetings in Riyadh, Ankara, Cairo, and Islamabad, and a war that was about to explode across the entire Middle East was quietly, surgically stopped cold. No press conference, no joint statement, no CNN breaking news banner, just silence. And in geopolitics, silence after chaos is never an accident. Silence is the sound of a deal being made. What you are about to hear is not a theory. It is a reconstruction of events, drawn from leaked diplomatic sourcing, regional intelligence reporting, and the timeline of military movements that don't lie, of how Pakistan's backchannel intervention in the final 72 hours before a potential Saudi-Iranian military escalation became the most consequential diplomatic operation of 2024 that almost nobody reported. And at the center of it all, one man, Mohammed bin Salman, a crown prince sitting on top of the world's largest oil reserves, commanding $1 trillion sovereign wealth fund, running a country that the entire Western financial order depends on. And in those 3 days, he was closer to losing everything than he has ever been in his life. To understand what Pakistan did, you have to understand what MBS was staring at. Because by early 2024, the Saudi crown prince was not dealing with one threat. He was dealing with 3 simultaneous pressure points, each one dangerous on its own, but together, they formed a strategic vice that was tightening around Riyadh with a speed that his own intelligence services had not anticipated. The first pressure point was Yemen. The Houthis, backed, funded, armed, and strategically directed by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, had escalated their drone and missile campaign to a level that Saudi air defense systems were struggling to absorb cleanly. More than 60 drone and ballistic missile incidents had been recorded across the border in a single calendar quarter. The Iron Dome equivalent systems deployed around Riyadh and critical oil infrastructure were intercepting the majority, but not all. And every single incident that broke through, every drone fragment that landed near a Aramco facility, every missile that forced an evacuation protocol, was a direct message from Tehran to MBS. The message was simple. We can reach you anytime, anywhere, and your American friends cannot stop all of it. The second pressure point was the Red Sea. By late 2023 and into 2024, Houthi attacks on commercial shipping in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait had triggered a full-scale international naval response. But that response, led by the United States under Operation Prosperity Guardian, had done something that MBS had not anticipated. It had internationalized the conflict in a way that removed Saudi Arabia's ability to control the narrative. Now there were American, British, French, and even Dutch warships conducting strikes in Yemen, strikes that were killing Houthi fighters, yes, but also generating massive regional sympathy for the Houthis among Arab street populations, from Morocco to Oman. And every bomb dropped by a Western Navy in Yemen was a propaganda gift that Iran was wrapping beautifully and distributing across the Arab world. MBS was watching his Abraham Accords normalization diplomacy, his grand vision of integrating Saudi Arabia into the Western economic order while maintaining Arab street credibility, begin to fracture in real time. The third pressure point was the one nobody was talking about publicly, and this is where it gets dangerous. Iran had moved, not rhetorically, not symbolically, physically moved. In the months preceding the escalation window that Pakistan would later intervene in, Iranian IRGC logistics infrastructure in Iraq and Syria had been significantly expanded. Forward operating positions, not large bases, but dispersed hardened small unit logistics nodes, had been identified by Saudi and American satellite imagery in the western Iraqi desert, within striking range of Saudi Arabia's northern border. This was not routine force posturing. This was pre-positioning. This was Iran telling its proxy networks, the Houthis, Iraqi militias, Hezbollah's logistics arm, to be ready for a coordinated multi-front activation. And MBS knew it. His intelligence chief had briefed him personally. The assessment was stark. If Saudi Arabia responded to any single Houthi escalation with direct kinetic action inside Yemen beyond its existing air campaign, meaning ground forces, meaning a full re-entry into the war it had publicly tried to exit, Iran had the infrastructure in place to activate all 3 fronts simultaneously. The Houthis from the south, Iraqi Shia militia from the north, and a limited Hezbollah missile barrage from the northwest through Syria as a distraction operation. Saudi Arabia, for all its oil wealth and F-15 fleet and Patriot missile batteries, does not have the ground force depth to fight a 3-front war. It never has. The 2015 Yemen intervention proved that. The Saudi military is air power heavy, logistics capable, but not structured or trained for sustained multi-front land combat against asymmetric irregular forces that specialize in dispersed, decentralized attritional warfare. MBS was trapped. He could not back down. Backing down in front of his own officer corps, his own population, after the Houthis had humiliated Saudi air defenses repeatedly, was not politically survivable. But escalating into direct confrontation risked triggering a regional war that his military could not win cleanly, that would crater oil prices through market panic, that would destroy the $500 billion NEOM megaproject investor confidence he had spent years building, and that would almost certainly delay or kill the U.S.-Saudi defense treaty that his entire strategic realignment with Washington depended on. He needed a third option, and he needed it in 72 hours. The phone rang in Islamabad at 2:17 in the morning. Pakistan's Army Chief, General Asim Munir, is not a man who receives calls at that hour from one number in particular without understanding immediately that the conversation will determine policy, not follow it. The call, according to sourcing from regional intelligence analysts who tracked the diplomatic traffic of that period, was from Riyadh, not from the Saudi Foreign Ministry, not through official diplomatic channels, directly, person to person, Crown Prince to Army Chief. This is important to understand because it tells you everything about the nature of the relationship and the nature of the ask. When MBS bypasses his own foreign ministry, he is calling in a debt that has been accumulating for years, through Saudi financial support during Pakistan's IMF crises, through shared intelligence on regional terrorist networks, through the quiet but consistent Saudi backing of Pakistan's military establishment as the de facto power center in a country that controls the Islamic world's only nuclear arsenal. Pakistan and Saudi Arabia do not have a normal bilateral relationship. They have a structural relationship, a relationship built on three pillars that have been reinforced over decades. The first pillar is financial. Saudi Arabia has been one of Pakistan's most consistent emergency lenders, providing billions in deferred oil payments and direct deposits to the State Bank of Pakistan during currency crises that would otherwise have triggered sovereign default. The second pillar is military. Pakistan has stationed military trainers, advisors, and in some periods, actual combat-capable units inside Saudi Arabia since the 1970s. The Saudi National Guard has been trained and structured with significant Pakistani military input. The third pillar is religious diplomatic. Pakistan carries enormous weight in the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and its support or silence on any Saudi position within that body can determine whether a resolution passes or fails. MBS was not asking Pakistan for troops. He was not asking for weapons. What he was asking for was something far more valuable in that specific moment. He was asking Pakistan to use its unique position, trusted by Iran to a degree that Saudi Arabia never could be, respected by Turkey as a fellow Sunni nuclear power, credible with Egypt as a fellow military establishment state, to open a communication channel that could carry a message Iran would actually believe. The message was this: Saudi Arabia is prepared to accept a 6-month cessation of escalation in Yemen in exchange for Iran standing down its forward-positioned assets in western Iraq. No public announcement, no formal agreement, no UN involvement, just a mutual step back from the cliff, verified through the one intelligence backchannel that both sides had reason to trust, Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence Directorate. This is not as straightforward as it sounds, because Iran does not trust Saudi Arabia. Iran does not trust the United States. Iran does not particularly trust Turkey, despite the rhetorical solidarity. And Iran deeply, specifically, institutionally distrusts any backchannel that it believes might be recorded, analyzed, or eventually surfaced to embarrass the supreme leader in front of his own hardline domestic constituency. But Iran has a different relationship with Pakistan. It is complicated, yes. Pakistan is a Sunni majority state, and Iran-Pakistan sectarian tensions are real, particularly in Balochistan, where Iranian-backed Shia militant groups and Pakistani Sunni extremist organizations have periodically clashed in ways that killed people on both sides. But at the state-to-state level, at the ISI to IRGC intelligence level, there exists a channel of communication that has survived multiple geopolitical earthquakes precisely because both sides have found it useful to maintain. Pakistan and Iran share a 900-kilometer border. They share water systems. They share tribal networks that no international boundary fully controls. And critically, Iran knows that Pakistan's ISI has never once leaked a backchannel communication to Western intelligence services, a track record that the CIA, MI6, and Mossad cannot claim with Iran. General Munir said yes. Within 18 hours of that first call, the Pakistani backchannel operation was running on 3 parallel tracks simultaneously. Track 1 was Riyadh, keeping MBS informed, receiving the specific parameters of what Saudi Arabia would accept as a face-saving mutual de-escalation, and making sure that the Saudi military did not take any unilateral action in those 72 hours that would collapse the diplomatic space before it could be used. Track 2 was Tehran, the ISI's channel to IRGC intelligence leadership, delivering the Saudi position in terms that were stripped of anything that could be read as ultimatum or humiliation, reframed as a practical mutual interest calculation, and accompanied by Pakistani intelligence assessments of what full escalation would actually cost Iran in terms of its own economy, its nuclear negotiating position, and its relationships with China and Russia, both of whom had explicitly signaled they did not want a regional war that would spike oil prices and destabilize their own strategic planning. Track 3 was the one that required the most delicate handling: Turkey and Egypt. This is where the operation became genuinely complex. Because Turkey, under Erdogan, had been running its own parallel diplomatic track with both Saudi Arabia and Iran, not for MBS's benefit, but for Turkey's own regional positioning agenda. Erdogan had been methodically rebuilding Turkish influence across the Arab world after years of post-Arab Spring isolation, and a Saudi-Iran war would have been, from Ankara's perspective, simultaneously a catastrophe for regional stability and an opportunity for Turkish mediation leverage. Erdogan did not want this war to happen, but he also did not want Pakistan to get credit for stopping it. Egypt, under el-Sisi, had its own calculus. Cairo is deeply uncomfortable with any scenario that strengthens Iran's regional influence, but it is equally uncomfortable with any Saudi military adventurism that destabilizes the Arab state system, because Egypt's own security depends on predictable, stable Arab state behavior. The Egyptian military intelligence service had been monitoring the escalation indicators closely and had reached its own conclusion. This was not going in a good direction, but Egypt's capacity to intervene was limited by its own economic crisis and its dependence on Saudi financial support, which made it impossible for Cairo to take any position that MBS might interpret as criticism. Pakistan threaded this needle by doing something diplomatically elegant. Rather than asking Turkey and Egypt to participate in the backchannel, which would have created turf competition and potentially leaked the operation, Pakistan's foreign ministry contacted its Turkish and Egyptian counterparts with a simple request. For the next 72 hours, please do not take any public position, make any statement, or conduct any diplomatic meeting related to the Saudi-Yemen-Iran situation. No explanation given. Just a request for a window of silence from a country that both Turkey and Egypt respected enough to honor a discreet ask. Turkey went quiet, Egypt went quiet. And in that silence, Pakistan's backchannel did its work. The Iranian response, when it came back through the ISI channel, was not an immediate yes. It was a question. And the question was telling. Tehran wanted to know whether Saudi Arabia's de-escalation proposal was coordinated with Washington. Because if it was, if the White House had prior knowledge of and was backing this backchannel, then Iran would interpret it as a U.S.-designed pressure operation using Pakistan as a cutout, and the entire thing would collapse. Iran would not give the Biden administration a diplomatic win dressed up as Pakistani mediation. This was the most dangerous moment in the entire operation, because the honest answer was complicated. The United States did not design this backchannel. Pakistan initiated it at Saudi request without prior American knowledge. But the United States, once it became aware through its own intelligence collection that something was happening, and the NSC became aware within approximately 24 hours, did not intervene to stop it, and in fact sent a quiet signal through the U.S.-Pakistan military channel that Washington would not interfere with the process. Pakistan communicated to Tehran a carefully calibrated version of this reality. This channel is Pakistani-initiated, Saudi-requested, and American-aware but not American-directed. The distinction was real, and it was exactly the kind of distinction that mattered to Iran's decision-making architecture, where the Supreme Leader's Office, the IRGC Command, and the Foreign Ministry often operate with different threat assessments and different red lines. The IRGC channel, the one that actually controlled the forward-positioned assets in western Iraq, signaled acceptance of the framework within 36 hours. Not enthusiastic acceptance, not a written agreement, but a signal through a channel that both sides knew was reliable, that the assets would not be activated during the 72-hour window, and that if Saudi Arabia honored its side of the framework, no new airstrikes, no new Houthi-specific ground force deployments, no additional Western naval coordination meetings in Riyadh, Iran would consider the framework the basis for a longer-term understanding. It was not peace. It was not even close to peace, but it was the cliff edge walked back from. And in that specific moment, that was everything. Now let's talk about what this actually cost. Because nothing in this region is free. Pakistan's intervention came with a price tag, not denominated in dollars, but in strategic obligations that Islamabad will be cashing in for years. Saudi Arabia, in the period immediately following the backchannel operation, accelerated its timeline on a previously stalled Saudi-Pakistan economic partnership framework that included deferred oil payment facilities worth approximately $3 billion, an expansion of the Saudi-funded development projects in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province, and, critically, Saudi backing for Pakistan's position in the next IMF review cycle. For a country that had been teetering on the edge of sovereign default and had just barely stabilized its currency through a combination of IMF emergency lending and Chinese rollovers, this was not a minor diplomatic courtesy. This was oxygen. Iran, for its part, tacitly acknowledged the Pakistani role by quietly shelving a series of pending cross-border pressure points in Balochistan that had been generating tension between Islamabad and Tehran for months. The Jaish-ul-Adl incidents, a Sunni militant group operating out of Pakistani Balochistan that had been conducting lethal raids inside Iranian territory, had been a consistent irritant that Iran had been signaling it might respond to directly. After the backchannel operation, that signaling stopped, not permanently, not with any formal guarantee, but stopped enough to be noticed by Pakistani intelligence as acknowledgement. Turkey extracted something different. Erdogan, once the backchannel had run its course and the immediate escalation risk had passed, moved quickly to position Turkey as a co-architect of the regional stability framework. Even though Ankara had played no direct role in the critical 72 hours, Pakistan did not contest this publicly. The diplomatic courtesy of allowing Turkey to share narrative credit was itself part of the payment structure. An investment in Turkish goodwill that Pakistan's foreign policy establishment understood it might need to draw on in the Kashmir diplomacy context, where Turkish support in the OIC has always been important. Egypt's reward was more subtle. Cairo received detailed intelligence sharing on Iranian militia logistics in Libya, an issue of direct Egyptian national security concern given Libya's role as a transit corridor for armed groups that threaten Egypt's western border. This intelligence, passed through a Pakistani-Egyptian military channel that had been quietly activated and expanded, gave Egypt's military intelligence service a clarity on the Libyan-Iranian connection that it had not previously had. For el-Sisi's government, which has staked its legitimacy in large part on its security state competence, this was enormously valuable. And here is the financial dimension of this entire episode that almost nobody is discussing, but which is, in the long run, probably the most consequential part of the story. Mohammed bin Salman's vision, the 2030 project, is not merely an economic development plan. It is an existential political project. MBS has staked his legitimacy, his right to eventually take the throne, his authority over the Saudi royal family's factional competition, his credibility with the young Saudi population that he has carefully cultivated through social reforms, on the promise that he is building a post-oil Saudi economy that will survive the energy transition. NEOM alone represents $500 billion in committed investment. The Red Sea tourism project, the Diriyah cultural restoration, the sports and entertainment portfolio, the Aramco IPO secondary tranches that depend on stable oil infrastructure valuation. Every single one of these projects requires investor confidence, and investor confidence requires geopolitical stability. A Saudi Arabia embroiled in a direct kinetic confrontation with Iran, even a limited, controlled one, would have triggered a risk premium spike across every single one of these investment frameworks that would have taken years to recover from. The sovereign wealth fund managers, the Japanese banks, the European infrastructure investors, the South Korean construction consortia, all of them have risk assessment models that would have automatically triggered withdrawal clauses or renegotiation demands the moment Saudi-Iranian hostilities crossed from proxy to direct. By Pakistan's intervention keeping the situation contained, MBS was not just saved from a military problem, he was saved from a financial catastrophe that could have set Vision 2030 back by 5 to 7 years. And in a project where the entire political logic depends on showing results within a specific timeline. Because MBS needs to show the Saudi population that Vision 2030 is working. Before the oil revenues that fund the social contract begin their structural decline, 5 to 7 years is not a delay. It is a potential project-ending failure. This is why the call came at 2:17 in the morning. This is why it went directly to the army chief instead of through diplomatic channels. This is why Pakistan, a country dealing with its own economic crisis, its own political instability, its own civil-military tensions, nevertheless deployed its most sensitive diplomatic assets to solve someone else's problem. Because in the transactional architecture of South Asian and Middle Eastern geopolitics, solving someone else's crisis at the right moment is not charity, it is investment. In Pakistan's military establishment, which has been operating in this transactional mode with Gulf states since the 1970s, understood exactly what it was investing in and exactly what return it expected. General Munir, in the months following the backchannel operation, was received in Riyadh with a level of ceremonial formality that is typically reserved for heads of state, not army chiefs. The photographs that came out of that visit, showing MBS greeting Munir at the palace entrance himself, rather than sending a protocol official, were not accidental. They were a message to everyone watching, to Pakistan's own domestic audience, to India, to the IMF, to Beijing, that Pakistan's military establishment had just demonstrated a value to the Gulf order that translated directly into real geopolitical capital. India noticed. New Delhi's foreign ministry analysts, tracking the same diplomatic traffic and the same ceremonial signals, understood that Pakistan had just significantly upgraded its strategic position in the Gulf, a region where India had been carefully building its own ties through the large Indian diaspora workforce, the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor project, and Modi's personal relationship diplomacy with MBS. The Pakistani backchannel operation did not reverse India's Gulf gains, but it inserted Pakistan back into the regional strategic calculus in a way that complicated India's preferred narrative of Pakistan as an isolated, failing state with nothing to offer the international order. China noticed, too, Beijing's relationship with both Saudi Arabia and Iran. It is, uniquely, the major power that has deep economic relationships with both simultaneously, exemplified by the 2023 China-brokered Saudi-Iran Normalization Agreement, meant that any backchannel operation affecting the Saudi-Iran equilibrium was something Chinese intelligence would track closely. The fact that Pakistan had run a successful operation in a space where China's own March 2023 normalization framework was supposed to be providing stability, and that Pakistan had done it without Chinese involvement or approval, was a signal that Beijing read carefully. Pakistan is not merely China's client state. It is an independent actor with independent capabilities in the Islamic world that China cannot replicate and cannot control. And then there is the nuclear dimension that hangs over every single one of these calculations, like a fact nobody wants to say out loud, but everyone is thinking. Pakistan is the only nuclear-armed Muslim-majority state in the world. That status gives it a weight in Islamic world diplomacy that is entirely disproportionate to its economic size or its conventional military power. When Pakistan speaks in back-channel diplomacy between regional powers, it speaks with an authority that derives not just from its ISI capabilities or its financial relationships, but from the implicit understanding that Pakistan's stability, Pakistan's alignment, Pakistan's choice of partners in any regional conflict matters in ways that no other Muslim state's choice of partners matters. A Saudi Arabia that has Pakistan firmly in its corner is a Saudi Arabia that is, by extension, adjacent to nuclear deterrence. That is not a threat. It is a fact of strategic geography that every serious actor in this region has incorporated into their planning. Iran understands this. Turkey understands this. Egypt understands this. And MBS, sitting in Riyadh at 2 in the morning with his military briefers telling him that the window for avoiding catastrophic escalation was closing, understood it most clearly of all. He did not call Washington first. He did not call London. He did not call Beijing. He called Islamabad. And that choice, that single 2:17 a.m. decision to reach for the Pakistani channel before any other, tells you more about the real architecture of power in this region than 1,000 diplomatic white papers or think tank analyses. The Middle East, that the world thinks it understands, the one shaped by American military dominance, Israeli intelligence supremacy, and Gulf oil wealth, is real, but it is not complete. There is a second layer underneath it, running in parallel, older in some ways than the American designed order, built on relationships and debts and capabilities that operate entirely outside the Western-facing diplomatic framework. And in that second layer, Pakistan, broke, politically chaotic, perpetually crisis-ridden Pakistan, sits at a node of connectivity that no other actor can replicate. The secret calls happened. The back channel ran. The war did not start. MBS is still standing, still building his $500 billion city in the desert, still hosting Formula One races, and signing PGA Tour deals, and meeting with Elon Musk and Sam Altman, and every major Western CEO who makes the pilgrimage to Riyadh. And somewhere in all of that carefully constructed image of a modernizing, confident, globally integrated Saudi Arabia, there is a debt. A quiet, unacknowledged, never to be publicly confirmed debt to a phone call that was answered at 2:17 in the morning in Islamabad. History will probably not record it clearly. The participants will not confirm it publicly. The intelligence services involved will not declassify the traffic for decades. But it happened. And the world that you're watching today, the world where the Saudi-Iran proxy war is contained, where Vision 2030 is still funded, where the oil markets did not crater, where MBS is still the most powerful Arab leader in a generation, that world exists in part because of what Pakistan did in 72 hours that nobody was watching. Pay attention to the quiet moments, because in geopolitics, the wars that don't happen are often more consequential than the ones that do, and the people who stop them are almost never the ones you see on the news.